Hi, this is Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Scholar Talks. On today's episode, we're honored to have back distinguished scholar Stephen Knott, who is going to discuss his important new book, which I have right here, The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, The Decline into Demagoguery, and the Prospects for Renewal. This is, of course, part two of our discussion in our two-part series. So welcome back, Steve. Thank you again for your willingness to join us for two parts.
Well, thank you, Tony. It's always a pleasure.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I'll introduce you again. Stephen F. Knott is a professor in the National Security Affairs Department at the Naval War College. He co-chaired the Presidential Oral History Program at the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia, which has a very useful website on all the presidents, by the way. He has taught teachers for many years at the graduate school program at the Ashbrook Center of Ashland University, and he's written numerous books, including, as I plugged in our first discussion, the book we wrote together, Washington and Hamilton, The Alliance That Forged America, also a superb book on Alexander Hamilton called Alexander Hamilton and the Persistence of Myth. He's currently hard at work on a book on the presidency of John F. Kennedy. And his website is stephenfknott, KNOTT.com. So, as part two of our series, can you maybe review your ideas from part one of our discussion, contrasting this, what you term the constitutional presidency, with what you term the populist presidency, and maybe give us an example to illustrate each one.
Oh, sure, Tony. Yeah, so the constitutional presidency, as envisioned by Washington and Hamilton, was a presidency where the occupant would serve as a unifying head of state, a president who understood that a president's words can have considerable impact on the body politic, and that it would be best to limit one's words, the amount of time that one would actually address the American public, which, by the way, was usually just done in writing, of course. But it emphasizes this head of state role. It rejects the idea, equally importantly, it rejects the idea that the president should serve as the voice of the people. And instead emphasizes the idea that the president has a unique responsibility to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And that there may be occasions when a president actually has to, in a sense, stand up to public opinion in favor of the rule of law. So the constitutional presidency of Washington and Hamilton I see as a rejection of what will come later, first to some extent under Thomas Jefferson, and then in a sort of full-blown, completely fleshed out version under Andrew Jackson and Andrew Johnson. And I mentioned the importance of language, the importance of choosing one's words carefully. You can see, I think, a real contrast between the constitutional presidency as practiced by Abraham Lincoln and the populist presidency as practiced by his immediate successor, Andrew Johnson. And you see this especially in Lincoln's second inaugural address, where Lincoln appeals to his fellow citizens, both North and South. Appeals to their better angels. And appeals to a sense of unity and can see a kind of restoration of the American Republic on the horizon, of the American Union on the horizon. And so you see in Abraham Lincoln a kind of magnanimity, some carefully chosen words. You see the exact opposite with his successor, Andrew Johnson. And in fact, at that very inauguration, Andrew Johnson shows up to be sworn in as Vice President of the United States, and he's drunk. He is not in control of his faculties. and gives this kind of slurring, people have trouble understanding what Vice President Johnson is saying. He doesn't recognize some members of Lincoln's cabinet who extend him the courtesy of attending his swearing in. It's quite an undignified performance. And I think right there, you see a kind of nice capitalization of the differences between the sober presidency of Washington and Hamilton and Lincoln, and that of the more popular, perhaps less sober presidency of an Andrew Johnson.
Well, Steve, after reading your magnificent book and racking my brain right now, I can't think of a starker example between the president and his or her successor regarding the constitutional and populist presidency. So, excellent, well done. So, all right. So, next question. You write in the book that Woodrow Wilson deserves recognition as the president who launched the activist presidency of the 20th century, which persists to this day. How does Wilson break with the founders, and how does he create a more visionary, more democratic presidency that's more consistent with what you label the populist presidency?
So Woodrow Wilson, of course, is our first president with a PhD. He spends much of his adult life in the academic world. And he's a student of American government and of American political history. He does develop a kind of contempt for the American Constitution and for the founders, some of the founders who drafted that document. I mean, on the one hand, Wilson recognizes that for the world they lived in, the founders lived in, they did do a good job in terms of securing political rights for the American citizenry. But Wilson believes in Darwin, he believes in evolution, he believes in a living constitution as a result, and believes that as the 20th century approaches, it's time for the United States to rethink its devotion to the Constitution and the American public's admiration for many of the founders who drafted the Constitution. So the Constitution must evolve with the times, and the presidency, Wilson comes to believe over time, is uniquely situated to lead this transformation, to bring the American people into the 20th century, to update, to modernize the American government. That will be the president's primary responsibility in the 20th century. And so when Wilson wins the presidential election of 1912, after segueing from an academic career into a political one, he makes it abundantly clear, as he puts it, that the president is free to be as big a man as he wants to be. There are not going to be the kind of 19th and 18th century restrictions on presidential power in the 20th century. If we are going to prevail, if the American system is going to survive in the 20th century, we have to move beyond that antiquated form of thinking. And so the changes occur across the board. The president emerges as the party leader. He emerges to some extent as the de facto Speaker of the House. It's his responsibility to educate the American public, so to speak, to bring them up to speed on 20th century realities. It's an across-the-board transformation of the role of the presidency. And I would argue in some ways it's an across-the-board transformation of the importance of the Constitution in the American mind.
Right. And, can you maybe give a few examples of that? I'm thinking here of, he presides over a real expansion of the administrative state and the
Yes.
executive agencies, and really kind of his visionary rhetoric, with leading the United States into war, making the world safe for democracy, as he terms it, and then personally going to Versailles, right, to hammer out the peace agreement, and then goes on this sort of whistle-stop tour to push it among the American people, sort of over the heads of the Senate. Seem to be some of the more striking examples from the book.
Yeah, no, good, all excellent points, Tony. Yeah, I mean, Wilson begins to see the president not only as the voice of the American people, but to some extent as the voice of peoples around the globe. The United States has a unique responsibility to bring the blessings of democracy to the rest of the world, and the president is in a unique position to lead that crusade. So there's an unbridled sense of America's role in the world, an unbridled sense of the president's responsibility to foster that role, both on the domestic front and on the foreign policy front. And as you said, Tony, you see it in his trip to Versailles, you see it in his proposal for a League of Nations. At home, you also see it, and you mentioned, Tony, the administrative state. Wilson, again, wanting to bring the American people and the American political system into the 20th century, believes in this notion of expertise, of a sort of skilled bureaucracy, a skilled administrative state, being part of that process of modernizing America. Wilson is all about efficiency. And in his view, efficiency requires centralization. And federalism, which talks and celebrates decentralization, is one of Wilson's enemies, in a sense. So the more you can centralize power in the United States, the more you can create a centralized, efficient bureaucracy, the better. And the better for bringing the United States into the 20th century. So, you know, I have issues with much of what Wilson stood for, but this is a significant president, for better or for worse.
Right, and a bit of a darker side too, right?
Yes.
In terms of policies towards African Americans as well as civil liberties during World War I.
Excellent points, and I'm glad you brought that up. And sadly, of course, one of the concerns that Washington and Hamilton had with a majoritarian, popularized or populist presidency is that minorities would pay the price. And by the way, you did see that, I think, during the age of Jackson. You did see it certainly to a great extent under Andrew Johnson. And you see it again here under President Wilson, where some of the progress, and I grant you it wasn't necessarily significant progress, but it was some progress. The federal workforce, for instance, in Washington, D.C., had been had finally taken steps towards integration, allowing African Americans to secure positions in the federal government. Wilson reverses all that. Wilson's administration reverses all that. A horrific record on racial matters. Of course, he welcomes the director of The Birth of a Nation to the White House to promote this overtly racist film. Right. And as you mentioned, Tony, on the civil liberties front, certainly during the First World War, his administration has an atrocious record, not just against people who were openly identified as Bolsheviks or openly identified as German supporters, but even people who spoke out against the draft, like Eugene Debs and others. They were imprisoned by the federal government for engaging in a form of political speech in opposition to the draft. This record of Wilson's on civil rights and civil liberties is very disturbing.
Right, gotcha. All right, well, moving on to FDR. He's the president who presides over the saving of capitalism during the Great Depression, defeating the Nazis and Imperial Japan during World War II. And yet you point out there are also several more troubling aspects of his presidency contributing to the development of this populist presidency.
Yeah, so obviously Franklin Roosevelt takes advantage of some technological developments, the advent of radio, to further Woodrow Wilson's vision, and I didn't touch on this, I should have, of a president sort of forming a personal bond with individual Americans. And of course, the technology of radio allows FDR to do that. So if you go to the FDR library in Hyde Park, New York, you'll find all these letters from people saying, I felt you were in my living room with me. That's exactly the kind of bond Woodrow Wilson envisioned for the 20th century presidency. And of course, as you said, Tony, I mean, FDR deserves, in my view, a lot of credit for assembling a first-rate national security team during the Second World War. I think he deserves a lot of credit for restoring American optimism during the Great Depression. I might even argue that he helped to save American capitalism. The downside was that as part of this populist presidency, FDR had a tendency to portray his opponents in very stark, inflammatory, polemical language, including just referring to Republicans as, in a sense, the enemy. To the point where in his 1944 State of the Union message, Franklin Roosevelt actually suggests that if the Republicans were to win the presidential and congressional elections that year, it would mark the triumph of fascism in the United States. And of course, this would be at the very moment that fascism in Europe and in Asia is being defeated. And yet he raises that specter here. He also, as we all know, engages in what I would consider to be a very polemical assault on the Supreme Court. And in a sense, I would argue, on the rule of law. With his court packing scheme, which of course goes down to defeat, but the kind of language that FDR used to attack the court is fairly rare in American history. He refers to these old men as being sort of captives of horse and buggy days, that they have not evolved with the rest of America in realizing the importance of technological changes, the Industrial Revolution, everything else that requires the Constitution and the American system of government to catch up. And these people are still living back in 1789. Very over the top, I would argue, damaging rhetoric. So while I can see a lot of merit with some of FDR's policies and practices as president, there's also an incredible amount of damaging rhetoric directed at the courts, directed at political opponents, and to build on your previous question, Tony, FDR's track record, certainly when it comes to civil liberties, regarding the status of Japanese American citizens, is hardly one that we can celebrate. So if you see yourself, the president, as in a kind of Wilsonian, I'm as big a man as I want to be, then nothing's going to stand in the way of you imprisoning 120 or so thousand Japanese Americans, because who's going to speak up for them? They're an unpopular minority, right? And so this is exactly the dangers of this majoritarian populist presidency, that if you sort of weaken the rule of law and you celebrate the president instead as a personality, and you give him this unbridled power, you end up with abuses of power like we did with the internment of these Japanese Americans.
Okay. Thank you. And so while many, or maybe most, 20th century presidents exemplify the populist presidency, you argue that there were some exceptions. I'm thinking here of William Howard Taft, Calvin Coolidge, by and large, Dwight Eisenhower. And so in what ways do they exercise the kind of restraint of the constitutional presidency?
Yeah, terrific question, Tony. And I've often thought that William Howard Taft is one of our more underestimated presidents. And I think I even suggest in the book that maybe he should be put up on Mount Rushmore if he would fit, which is, I grant you, an open question. But I'd replace Teddy Roosevelt and I'd put Taft up there in a jiffy. And the reason for that is that Taft actually pursued a fairly progressive agenda. As I understand it, more antitrust suits were brought during the Taft years than were brought under Teddy Roosevelt. More conservation land was set aside under William Howard Taft than occurred under Teddy Roosevelt. But Taft does not engage in the kind of demagoguery that you see from TR, especially as time goes on, and especially during TR's Bull Moose campaign in 1912. Taft does not attack the Supreme Court. Taft does not do anything to sort of weaken the rule of law. And Taft downplays the personal elements of the presidency. He does not attempt to present himself as a kind of warm and fuzzy figure, as TR did. TR was constantly parading his family out in front of the press. That's a very much a populist, modern conception of something a president should do. Taft rejects that. He's a throwback to that more restrained constitutional model, and for that reason and many others, I really respect and think Taft deserves more attention than he receives. You mentioned Coolidge. I have to confess, and this may be one of the weaknesses in the book, there's not a lot of discussion in there about Coolidge, and perhaps I should have devoted more attention to Coolidge. However, there is a quotation from Coolidge that is absolutely terrific, that I think goes to the heart of my thesis, and I'll loosely paraphrase the quotation here. But Coolidge says something to the effect of, it's very easy for an American president to set the American public alight, to fire them up, to divide them, to pit them against one another, to be the captive of jealousies, etc. And a president should not do that. So Coolidge had that Washingtonian understanding of the important role of the president as a head of state and as a unifier. And I wish I had devoted more attention to that. I do see some elements, as you mentioned, in Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower also, I think, understood the importance of the president's role as a head of state. He played that role to the max. Eisenhower avoided the kinds of personal attacks that characterized the presidencies of, for instance, Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. In fact, Eisenhower would frequently get upset at staff members or cabinet officers of his who engaged in those kinds of personal attacks. He was always keenly aware that one should erect a high wall of separation between policy disputes and the personalities involved. And so you see Eisenhower have a terrific relationship, for instance, with Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson of the opposite party, which I think did a lot of good for the United States in terms of pushing through the Interstate Highway Act, a Civil Rights Act of '57, and other initiatives. So of the sort of modern presidencies, and I'm probably dating myself here by classifying Eisenhower as modern, but of the modern group of presidents, yeah, I think Eisenhower comes perhaps the closest to emulating the model set by Washington and Hamilton and others.
Right, and just as an aside, Ike really did that tremendously in World War II. I think you point out, holding the alliance together and not allowing his generals to criticize the British, even when sometimes they deserved it.
Great point, Tony. Yeah, I mean, this man was a master consensus builder, in some ways an extraordinary diplomat. I mean, he's finally received his due. It took way too long in those perennial polls of presidential greatness for Eisenhower to receive the due, to receive the rewards he is due. I mean, he's now finally almost always ranked in the top 10, and I think that's remarkably well deserved. He conducted himself with dignity. He understood, as I said, the importance of the president as a unifying figure.
Good. Well, you demonstrate that technology, mass communications, whether in the form of newspapers and then radio, television, of course, today we have the internet and social media, they've greatly facilitated the growth of this populist conception of the presidency. Can you cite a few examples throughout the 20th century?
Sure. So while FDR uses radio to strengthen or to embed the kind of Wilsonian vision of the presidency, having this personal relationship with the public. John F. Kennedy will use television to remarkably great effect. And of course, Kennedy arguably was made for television. You know, good-looking man, relatively young, appeared to be healthy, although we know now that wasn't quite true, but he certainly came off as vigorous. And he understood the power of visual images, both in terms of his television presentations, which he put a remarkable amount of work into, including consulting with various figures in Hollywood that he knew of. But also he put a lot of work into print visual images, and having grown up during this era, I can remember the weekly arrival of Life magazine, or Look magazine as well, in my parents' home. And they were usually filled with all sorts of pictures of President Kennedy romping with his children at Hyannis Fort, or his beautiful first lady, or whatever. Kennedy understood the importance of visual images. And, you know, for better or for worse, it's quite possible, although you'll get some divisions on this in the scholarly world, but it's quite possible that Kennedy's election was due to the way he looked in those 4 televised debates with Richard Nixon. People who watched the debates on television gave the edge to Kennedy. People who listened to it on radio and weren't seeing that visual image of this young, good-looking candidate, as opposed to the sweaty, ghost-like looking Richard Nixon, whose eyes were darting back and forth as if he was in a police lineup. Those who didn't see those images gave the edge to Nixon. Now, that may have something to do with a more rural Republican audience, not quite having television, but whatever, you get the point. Kennedy rode TV into the White House, and sadly, by the way, I think one of the reasons for his hold on the American imagination was his tragic assassination, which is the first time the 3 major television networks at the time stayed with a news story from beginning to end. They went over, I think, 72 hours straight on that sad November weekend in 1963. And all those images of John F. Kennedy Jr. saluting his father's coffin,
Right.
of Jacqueline Kennedy lighting the eternal flame, etc., were just embedded in generations of Americans.
Right. And now we have you know, social media and you know, YouTube, the internet, blogs. That's certainly contributed, it seems, to the populist view of the presidency, as well as maybe the poisoning of our national discussion as well.
Yeah, I think so, Tony. I mean, I've tried not to be too pessimistic in this book, but I do think, and I'm not the first to say this, and this is not my area of expertise, but it does seem as if social media, instead of living up to the expectations of its founders, of a kind allowing for a free exchange of ideas, instead we're all seeking, you know, shelter in various forums where we're just going to hear people who think like we do, and any dissenter is going to be, you know, drummed out fairly quickly. And that's been bad for American politics, I think. The other thing I would add is, because we are all so connected, it makes deliberation in Washington, D.C., whether it's at the presidential level or at the congressional level, it makes it almost impossible. Because the minute there's any suggestion of a possible compromise, interest groups on all sides of the equation are going to use this great technology we have to try to go after their representatives, or again, even the president on occasion, to try to get them to shift their positions, to stay true to the party platform or whatever. It's just made compromise, consensus, deliberation, it seems to be nearly impossible. So, you know, I'm hopeful for the future. I hope we can restore some elements of this earlier conception of the presidency and of the Constitution itself. That's right. One of the reasons, the main reason why I wrote this book.
Right, and I think it'll go a long way towards helping to restore this conversation. So, And we do have an inauguration upon us, and you mentioned in the book that the modern populist presidents have used the occasion of the inauguration for a very strong visionary idealism, kind of like Wilsonianism, and laying out this sort of expansive vision of what the federal government can do at home and abroad. It's usually promised in the first 100 days of the new administration. So, how can a new president use the inauguration instead to convey the founders' presidency, as you term it?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, Tony. I do think one of the themes of the book is this sort of inflated rhetoric, inflated expectations that you see in inaugural addresses and in other presidential statements that just never seems to end. Both parties sort of bidding to outdo one another in terms of what they can promise to their base. And it's going to require, to get back to that healthier conception that you alluded to, it is going to require presidential candidates, I think, to stop overpromising, to stop fueling these expectations. But you know what? That's ultimately on all of us. Mm-hmm. It's ultimately on the American people to resist the siren call of heightened expectations, or to resist the siren call of demagogues who try to pit Americans against their fellow citizens who disagree with them. It's easy to blame the politicians. It's easy to blame some, presidents, as I, to some extent, have done in this book. But I do conclude the book by noting, again, this is on us. As American citizens, we have to also embrace a more sober understanding of the role of government, a more sober understanding of what the presidency can deliver. If we do that, then I think we have a really good chance of returning to a healthier political order. Because it does seem to me that things at the moment are out of sort.
Right. So you're saying we really look to the president to solve all of our problems, and they either cause them or they solve them, right? Everything that goes right, they take credit for. Everything that's wrong, they're blamed for, right? In this country. So maybe we should look more to civil society and to other institutions, and maybe the three branches of government and different levels of government, rather than just the president.
Well put. And that wasn't the gist of my book, but I do mention in passing towards the end that if we do restore this more sober, restrained constitutional presidency, it should have the effect, I would think, of restoring Congress to its proper role. And if that were to happen, that would be just one of many, I think, good things to stem from this restoration.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's the point of my final question, and I think ending on a hopeful note, as you do in the book. You quote James Madison in the conclusion, I think kind of as you started in part one, the first question, that Madison wanted representative government to refine and enlarge the public views. So how can the lost soul of the American presidency be restored to return to that healthy, energetic, and restrained presidency and social civic order?
Yeah, another terrific question, and it's a real challenge for us as Americans. One proposal I make in the book, and I realize, having spoken to a few groups about this one doesn't go over especially well. But I do think we need a presidential selection process that has some screening or filtration to it. In other words, and in my view, that's probably only possible with a restoration of some type of party leadership role in the actual selection of presidential nominees. We've democratized the process so much that I think we do have a tendency to reward those candidates in both parties who overpromise or perhaps engage in an excessive amount of demagoguery. And if the party leaders were allowed to select nominees, yes, you might end up with a kind of smoke-filled room mediocrity like a Benjamin Harrison, let's say. But on the other hand, you know, a Benjamin Harrison did not do a lot of damage. The system remained intact. The expectations of what the federal government and the presidency would deliver were kept at a minimum. These people, for the most part, did no harm. And that's not a bad thing. I think we underestimate the importance of stability. We're all, in some ways, captivated by change, and we expect the presidents to be change agents. That's a mistake. And so, again, one perhaps practical step that I would advocate is the restoration of the role of political parties and their leadership in terms of the actual selecting of presidential nominees.
Very good. Well, Stephen Knott, the book is The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, The Decline into Demagoguery, and the Prospects for Renewal. Steve Knott, I want to thank you again for joining us in this two-part conversation. If you like this video, please be sure to subscribe to our channel and comment your thoughts below. We put out new videos every Tuesday and Thursday, exploring U.S. history and civics, including our regular primary source close reads, scholar talk interviews with distinguished scholars from around the country, and homework help videos for students. And come join our lively conversation on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for updates on programs, events, and ways to get involved with BRI. Thank you very much for joining us.